Welcome to Renegade Inc. The Renaissance is known as a foundation stone of the modern world through both its art and ideas. But lesser known is that it was also a time when the modern banking system was created. The Medici Bank was the most influential, yet the trouble it attracted with the church and the state over using usury as a business model is a problem that our societies still face today. Tim Parks, welcome to Renegade Inc.
Glad to be here. Hello.
Tim, recently we spoke to an economist called Steve Keen. He is looking at the detrimental effects of climate change. And one of the things that he attributes to climate breakdown is the fact that we measure every single thing now in monetary terms. Is it the case that this financialization that's ripped through society, is it a case that we can go back to the Medici era and look at what they were doing in their banking system and say some of that has been transposed to now, but it's just been done on steroids because of money, making money out of money, usury, and all this synthetic credit derivative swaps, etc.?
Well, listen, money has always been a scandal. Just the existence of money as a unit of measure which measures everything. And there's certainly nothing new about measuring everything with money. If you think about the 15th century, you had the price of a prayer for the dead, you had the price of a prostitute, you had the price, you could measure, you could say a prostitute costs you this and a prayer for the dead costs you that. So as soon as you've got money, you have got a universal unit of measure for every service. Okay, and clearly that's a huge problem. But I think the other thing that one has to understand that you said how much this has changed and we're on steroids. We're on steroids from the moment that money ceases to be a piece of gold which is worth what it is because it's gold.
Right.
To the moment when it's worth what we agree it is. And then when it disappears in paper, and then when it starts to move around without us knowing where it is. If you imagine a world without money, and particularly without paper money, and without bills of exchange and checks and so on, then everything is visible. I know how rich this guy is. I know what he owns. I can see his cattle. I can see everything. And if necessary, I can intervene. I know who is rich and who isn't rich. Okay. When I have money, I don't know if this guy's got everything in the bank, and I don't know which bank it's in.
Right.
I don't know where it is. I can't get rid of it. I can't tax him because I don't know how much he has. Then when this guy starts making money out of money, and I don't know how much money he makes out of money, and then he gives that money to other people, and then other people borrow that money, and from being an ordinary miller, or for being a worker or a guy who works on a loom making wool, or a farmer who works on the land. He says, give me some money, he invests it in something and he gets rich. And all of a sudden, that pyramid of society, which was medieval society, had this notion, the pyramid with everybody having their particular position. As soon as you have money and loans with interest, then the whole of society becomes much more fluid. You have social mobility, which is a wonderful thing, but not maybe perceived as a wonderful thing if you liked the idea of a completely stable society.
The Medici banking dynasty is something that you have given an awful lot of time to thinking about, and you've written extensively about it. What did the Medici banking dynasty give us today when it comes to modern finance and when we look back to Renaissance times?
The Medici Bank starts in about 1398 and runs to 1497, right? It's nowhere near as big as the banks of the previous century, the so-called Peruzzi Bank. They made vast fortunes. The Peruzzi Bank, from operating from Florence in the 14th century, had 83 locations outside Florence, mostly all over Europe. Okay. What the Medici brought were two things. From the purely economic, financial side, they solved the problem which had destroyed the Peruzzi Bank, which was bad loans. bad loans to the King of England, and the whole system collapsed. It was the English fault. And what the Medici did was they more or less invented a kind of holding company, so that all their different outlets, if you want, their branches all over Europe were separate companies, and you couldn't get the same kind of collapse. But I think far more important than that was that the Medici, more than any other group, really intuitively began to look at how money could be made respectable. So it was the Medici Bank that started the major investments in church architecture and huge charitable operations, spending money on everybody to get consensus, and in that way moving into politics as well. But most of all, there was this problem. Usury, or just interest rates of any kind, were considered a sin worse than almost any other sin. You could only be forgiven for this sin with full restitution. Now, full restitution is impossible when you've been making money. The problem then with that whole question of interest rates was how to make money respectable. And two things happened, basically. One was the invention of the bill of exchange, where a kind of interest was hidden in a currency exchange. But the other thing was this willingness to invest in the church and to take into the austere space, because the churches, if you look at the churches before the 15th century, they're very austere.
Yes.
On the ceiling of the baptistry in Florence, you've got heaven and hell, and that's it. There's no negotiation between heaven and hell. Everything is just austere, black and white. And what the Medici first and then others began to do was to introduce into this space luxury.
Right.
Like the Madonna is dressed in beautiful clothes. They loved to show the three kings, the Magi, because they were rich men who were good, you know. They loved to show the coronation of the Madonna, where gold is put on the Madonna's head, you know?
And is all this a cleansing process for the act of making money? In a sense, are they the first philanthropists, really, and sponsors of the arts to be able to sort of cleanse that process of making hard, cold cash?
Well, they're certainly not the first philanthropists, because Christian charity is as old as Christianity. But they are the first people to really negotiate this space of the church and to introduce a certain amount of confusion into the church and into the idea of whether money is good or bad or whatever. Like, the church becomes a more comfortable place. Like, it's one thing just to give money away to charity, which they did. And it's another thing to make the church look like a bourgeois, comfortable lounge. And of course, many people in the church hated this. Many people in the church hated it. And, you know, when at the end of the 15th century, you have Savonarola coming along, and also the Protestant Reform, it was very much in response to this kind of thing. They said, no, we don't want any of this stuff in the church. Let me just say that today we see the same thing in the way the banks sort of clean their consciousness, investing in sports, investing in cultural programs, sponsoring museums, and so on and so forth. And they like to be very discreet and very in the background. You know, I'm not against it. I mean, I'm just saying that all begins with the Medici.
So this relationship with the entrepreneur, the businessman, the banker, whoever it is, making money, God would look unfavorably on it. So how do they in some way pass this off as a virtuous act? How do you camouflage that? Because you mentioned, you know, moving up in society and more fluidity. Surely God is at the top of that pyramid and judging. How do you marry your commercial activity with pleasing the big guy?
You know, with difficulty and never being quite sure if you're getting it right. But the easy way to talk about this is to give a simple and absolutely crucial episode. In the 1430s, Cosimo de' Medici is the head of this bank, doing these bills of exchange, which nobody's quite sure whether it's usury or not. He speaks to the Pope Eugene, whatever he was, I can't remember the number, and he says, I probably sinned a lot. How can I resolve this? And the Pope says, spend 10,000 florins renovating the convent of San Marco, which was in disrepair. Now, 10,000 florins was what it took to set up a new bank. Okay, it was a huge, it would be like the price of 10 skyscrapers today. Okay, and Cosimo says, okay, I'll do that, but only if you change the monks in the convent, because in that period, the monks in the convent, they were the San Silvestrino monks, they were considered to be very lax. They drank, and there was talk of women. And Cosimo said, no, I want the Dominicans in there. Now, the Dominicans were the ones who were poor, who were righteous and religious. So this rich man actually insists on a religion which is terribly serious. And then when he has it renovated, he introduces a beautiful library full of books, okay, many translated from Latin and Greek. And he has his own private cell built close to the cells of the monks. And in his cell, there's a beautiful fresco of the three magi, okay. And he has inscribed in stone, this is for the forgiveness of my sins, okay. It's actually inscribed in stone. And then he has Fra Angelico do these wonderful, wonderful images of Christian suffering, of the beauty of the Madonna, the Annunciation, and so on. Now, in the refectory where Cosimo didn't go, somebody wrote on one of the paintings, one of the monks wrote something like, in English it would be, may damnation fall on he who has brought money into our house.
Oof.
Okay. So not everybody was on board. There was this constant tension. And a lot of the guys in the church were saying, yeah, look, we're using this money for the glory of God, so it's okay. And then others were saying, well, wait a minute, aren't we legitimizing a form of behavior and so on and so forth. So there was a tension that was actually very, very fertile, because the more tense it was, the more beautiful the objects became, and then when you had the backlash with Savonarola, and he just said, no, that's enough, and he became head of the convent of San Marco, then, everything got burnt, and you have the bonfire of the vanities and beautiful paintings being burnt in the public square. So, there's always tension between these things, and these are going on today. You can see your man who's worried about monetary values and stuff. You can find poems from the 12th century that are saying exactly the same thing.
Tim, in the first half, you mentioned what the Medicis had brought to modern finance, and one of the things is a holding company. That meant that their banks were distributed as opposed to centralized. The Medici Bank and the Bardi Bank both collapsed. Those empires collapsed, those dynasties collapsed because of bad loans, because they were centralized. Medici more distributed. The other thing that Medici gets credited for, excuse the pun, is the double entry bookkeeping system. Was it him? Was it them that came up with this, or did he just pick that idea up from somewhere else?
Double entry accounting had already been around for a while when the Medici started operating, and they themselves didn't always operate with a double entry accounting. The Florentines and also the Sienese were way ahead on this for a very long time. But let's say this, these banks were as good as the people running them at that particular moment.
Right.
So, for example, the Medici did invent this idea of they had something like 20 different branches around Europe. And in each branch, like 40% would be owned by the local bank manager, and then the rest owned by the family. so they could bring a lot of capital into their banking system, but then keep control of all the separate branches. That was another problem that the Peruzzi had, that they lost control of their own bank. So they did this, but then later they dropped this. And in fact, they themselves went broke, giving bad loans, again, political loans to Milan, to England, and to Bruges. There were all kinds of reasons why that happened. One thing is, it's impossible to keep money away from politics.
Right.
And this is another thing where, when you look at this period, it's obvious that what goes on in the modern world takes us right back there. Because a banker obviously begins to have an enormous amount of power, because he's lending to people and people become deferent to him, and he begins to get control of the situation. So the government tries to tax him. The government tries to block him, and he gets cannier and cannier with moving his money around. And then he says, no, I'll have to be the government.
One of the things that Cosimo was very, very good at was credit creation. So he'd use double entry bookkeeping, as we do today, to create credit, private banks to create credit out of thin air and lend it at interest. And back in the day, he would use a letter of credit brilliantly to, let's say, augment his books and push his power far and wide. Have modern bankers looked at him as a bit of a forerunner?
Let's try and nail what Cosimo actually did and what the bankers in Florence were actually doing. They were not allowed to give interest-bearing loans. As a result, they didn't invest their money locally very much at all. The only way to lend money and get more money was to pretend that it was an exchange deal.
Right.
So, for example, somebody comes to my bank. Okay, I'm out in the street with my table. They had their tables out in the street. Somebody comes and says, he really wanted 1,000 florins. And he said, you give it to me, I'll give it to you back in sterling. Okay. So then we pretend that it isn't him who's asked for the money, but that it's the bank who's asked to change some money. Okay. Right. Now, why can we make money like this? Because, of course, we don't have pound sterling in Florence. They didn't hold foreign currencies. So that means we have to go to London for that. And it takes time to go to London. 90 days, Florence to London. Of course, it was ridiculous. You could get to London much quicker than 90 days. But that was the time it would take you to buy a load of silks, to arrange for a shipping, to get the silk shipped all the way around the Mediterranean, the Bay of Biscay, to London, to sell the silks. Okay, so you've used your loan of 1,000 florins, and then you pay the guy 40 pence. But in London, sterling is worth more than in Florence. In London, the exchange rate is 36. So I get the money at 40 in a place where the exchange rate is 36. And then I do the same deal going back.
Wow.
Okay, so if you work it out, you've made about 10% in 6 months going back and forth. And then what they did was simply eliminate the actual exchange of money. They just pretended that the money was being exchanged when actually it wasn't. One of the things that's going on that's really crucial is that because of all these moral worries about money, you start getting financial exchanges described in ways which don't actually describe what's going on. So you get a kind of difference between the way we talk about what's happening and what's really happening. And that is absolutely crucial about, in fact, there's something the same goes on, I think, I don't want to become polemical, but in certain kinds of loans in Sharia law, there's a sort of dubiousness about what is actually going on in those loans.
And is that because Islamic finance posits that actually usury and interest are bad, and therefore they bury that within that loan in some way to morally cleanse it, but ultimately it sits on top of the capitalist system that we have, and that's an interest-bearing system, so for every reason you have to pass that cost on to the punter.
Yeah, they have the same objections to usury, which, let me say that I really actually respect the whole early Christian position on this. It wasn't stupid. The idea was, if everybody starts thinking about borrowing money and making money and interest rates, when are they going to think about their souls? When are they going to think about God? And you remember all those early pictures of usurers. They're all tight with their money. You know, they're all closed mentally. They're pictures of people with, this is what it's about. Okay. And your man who you mentioned before saying, you know, we've monetized everything. We don't care about nature, is making exactly the same complaint about money that the people who objected to usury were making so many years ago.
One of the other areas of work that you have focused on is translation of Machiavelli. Whenever I see a newspaper interview with a CEO or a chairman, often when they're asked, you know, what time they get up in the morning, what breakfast they eat, what car do they drive, where they go on holiday, often they say, favorite book. And 9 times out of 10, every clunking CEO, alpha male type will say The Prince by Machiavelli. What's your view on that? I.e., using the prince in the boardroom to try and gain advantage over the competition. Was that the real reason behind the book being written?
The book is much maligned and probably misunderstood. I mean, it's really not a book about how to cheat people, that's for sure. Let's remember that Machiavelli himself had been a politician for most of his life. He got kicked out when there was regime change introduced from abroad. He was arrested and tortured for something he hadn't done. And then he was sent into a sort of domestic exile, sent back to his wife in the country, which bothered him because he was a philanderer. And there he sat down and he wrote this book. And the idea was to write a book that would get him back into politics by explaining to a prince or to a leader, because, you know, the word prince is not, I mean, didn't mean Prince, he didn't mean Prince Charles, you know, he didn't mean Prince Charming, he meant the boss, basically. He would explain to them how to get power and how to stay in power.
Right.
So that was the basic idea. But Machiavelli was a really intelligent scholar, and he soon loses interest, I think, in just the business of how to persuade this or that guy to give me a job. And he starts really looking at how you get power and how you stay in power. And it is a really frightening analysis. The basic idea behind it is that if you want to stay in power, that must be your only priority. Oh. If you put any other priority before staying in power, then very likely you will lose power.
Right.
Everything is prioritized in relation to that. And he doesn't say, oh, this is immoral, or, you know, we're going to have to put the means before the end or something. He just says this is the way it actually is, right, if you want to stay in power.
So he's quite a pragmatist, really.
Oh, he's one of the world's great pragmatists. But he does make it quite clear that a leader won't stay in power forever if his people hate it. So that the business of governing well is absolutely essential to staying in power. But then there may be all kinds of ways that you would understand that. For example, it may be necessary to be absolutely ruthless and cruel and eliminate a bunch of people in order to make it possible to run the show. Yeah. He makes no moral comment about that, which is why the book became such a scandal. But he also lived at a time, and we have to remember that these times we're talking about were times of just incredible change, endless war. And Machiavelli believed that stability at the top was probably the best thing for any state, as long as the leader wasn't absolutely cruel and terrible. Then stability was actually in everybody's interest.
It strikes me that all the elements that we talk about when it comes to the Medicis, we're not a million miles from them now, are we? When we look at the modern banking system, usury, lending money, credit notes, double entry bookkeeping, it's all there today. It's been there throughout history, but so has our really difficult, muscular relationship between money, government, God, and each other.
Absolutely. essentially there's this constant feeling that money is running away with the show, and we're not in control of it. We don't understand it. We read about trading in futures. We read about, we feel that, wait a minute, there's this huge machine that's taken over, and what about the business of me just being alive today? What does it mean to be good? What does it mean, So there's a tension between these things. Of course, let's remember that money is fantastically exciting. Cosimo de' Medici said, if I could make a money by waving a wand, I would still be a banker. It was fun working out how to make money.
And that tension still sits with us today, doesn't it? Insofar as people destroy their lives chasing fiat currency.
They do indeed. I myself drive a pretty hard bargain when I try and sell a book, So, yeah, we all know then, and we read endlessly in the paper, I suddenly realized that, I should go and start a farm in the west of Ireland or so on. There's always people dropping out, people going to meditation retreats. The problem is to find some kind of stable position in all this, not to oscillate between being obsessed by money and then, trying to become a Buddhist monk for a few months and then coming back to being obsessed by money again. The problem is to find some sort of equilibrium, in the crazy world we live in.
Tim, it's been an education. It's been a wonderful history lesson. It has been a really lovely end of us refocusing on what really matters. Thank you for Medici Money. Thank you for your work on Machiavelli. And thank you very, very much for your time, Tim Parks.
Thanks a lot. It's been fun to talk. Thank you.